All right, if we're going to talk about budgeting, there's a few things we have to understand about national budgets, and this is some of it is specific to the United States, but this can also apply to other countries or state budgets or even large organization budgets. So the first thing that people need to understand, and I see this mistake made a lot, is the difference between a deficit and a debt, right? So a deficit is how much more are you spending than you're earning every year, right? And deficits rise and fall based on economics, based on who the president is, how much we're spending, how much we're taxing, all those things, right? But the deficit is a year by year, how much more or less are you spending than you're making via taxes and other income sources for that organization or government, right? And deficits can go up and down relatively quickly year to year, although it's always much easier to make deficits increase, i.e., spend more, spend more, spend more without taking more money in, than it is to go the other direction. Reducing deficits is a lot harder than increasing deficits. And of course, if we get a negative deficit, i.e., we take in more money than we spend, we have a surplus. But surpluses have been relatively rare in the United States. The last time we had a surplus was for 1, maybe 2 years in the very late 90s. The vast majority of years, the U.S. government runs a deficit. Now, those deficits combine to form the national debt. That's the total amount of money we have borrowed throughout the entirety of United States history. So it's kind of a running total of all the money we owe to other people, usually organizations or banks that have bought government bonds and so on and so forth. So our current national deficit is currently, I think, a couple $100 billion. I think we're below $1 trillion at this point. But our debt is at some ungodly 20-something trillion dollars. But a lot of people like to talk about whether certain presidents or certain Congresses have increased the debt and by how much. But a much better way to look at it is the deficit. Have they increased or decreased the deficit? Because that is a much more indicative measure of how fiscally responsible any given presidency or congressional session has been. Now, when talking about United States budgets, there's mandatory spending and there's discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is stuff we have to spend, basically. This is, pre-authorized legislation that previous Congresses have committed the United States to spending. Major programs like Social Security and Medicare. And then discretionary spending is what we're choosing to spend this year. We are not locked into spending any of that money. This is all stuff that Congress or the president or whoever can increase or decrease or eliminate entirely. Whereas mandatory spending is stuff that essentially we have to spend. Discretionary is kind of what we choose to spend. The vast majority of mandatory spending is on entitlement programs. And I've seen a lot of people get upset by the name of entitlement programs. They see kind of a negative connotation to the word entitlement. When really all entitlement means is if you meet the requirements for the program, you get to participate in the program, right? So like Social Security. If you reach a certain age, you get to receive Social Security benefits. You are entitled to those. No government bureaucrat or agency can say, no, we don't like you because you've done this, you voted for the other team, whatever. If you meet the requirements as set out in by law, you are entitled to that money, right? So when you hear entitlement program, don't think of entitlement in kind of the pejorative sense. Think about it in the, you are entitled to that sense. Now, another big confusing issue about budgets is that the fiscal year, i.e., the year that we're creating these budgets for, does not run from January 1st to December 31st like the calendar year does. The fiscal year starts on October 1st of every year and then ends on September 31st of the following year. And the fiscal year is named after the year it ends in, right? So on October 1st, 2019 is the beginning of fiscal year 2020, right? And so on and so forth. But the financial year is 2 months. 2 months offset 3 months. I'm not very good at math. I'm not a professor of math either. It's 3 months offset from the calendar year. So when you're looking at, say, deficits year by year by year, keep in mind that the deficit for, say, 2024 was due to the fiscal year and the fiscal policies and the budgeting process that was done in 2023 under that Congress, under that president, etc. And that can be a little bit confusing. So here is the most recent numbers I could find as of time of recording, and that is for 2022, fiscal year 2022. So remember, this started October 1st, 2021, right? And as you can see, about 2/3 to 3/4 of all of our spending is under that mandatory banner, right? So that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, etc. That's all stuff that Congress can't really mess with. That's money we have committed ourselves to spending, and we can't increase that or decrease that using the budgetary process. And out of the quarter to roughly a third that is discretionary, roughly half of that goes to the Department of Defense. And that's defense, that's Veterans Affairs, etc. So when people talk about, the United States needs to reduce its deficit, we need to, get more fiscally responsible, almost nobody of either party has any real desire to decrease defense spending, because that's politically unwise, let's just say. So when we're talking about cutting the federal budget and cutting programs and being more fiscally responsible, we're talking about a very small chunk of the pie that we're even capable of really affecting. And that's that 15% in 2022 that is non-defense discretionary spending. And even if you eliminated the entirety of it, we still wouldn't have a balanced budget. So if any politician ever tells you that they want to have a balanced budget or require a balanced budget or pass a law saying we must have a balanced budget, if they don't also accompany that with either major mandatory spending reform or promise to cut defense spending pretty seriously, they're not being serious, because it is literally mathematically impossible to have a balanced budget without cutting one of those two areas, either mandatory spending or defense spending. All right, so one of the things that the United States does a lot is to try to influence the private economy via government spending and government financial policy, right? And there's a bunch of different ways they can do that. But that process of trying to influence the economy, make the economy better, slow inflation or increase inflation at some point, or increase jobs, increase investment in the stock market. There are lots of things they can do indirectly to influence those things, right? Obviously, the most obvious one there is taxing and spending, right? They can increase taxes on certain things. They can decrease taxes. So if we want gas prices to go down and people to travel more, we can reduce the federal gasoline tax. If we want people to invest more, we can lower the government bond interest rates, things like that, right? If we want people to go to national parks more, we can give more money to the National Park Service. All those things have implications for investments and spending and hiring. And that is something the government definitely has a vested interest in doing. The people in charge of most of the fiscal policy directly are the Federal Reserve Board. And the Federal Reserve is one of those organizations that's mostly governmental, but also semi-private. And the Federal Reserve Board is, I think it's 9 people, but don't quote me on that. But they are appointed by the president and confirmed by Congress. And they're able to set things like interest rates, and then increasing or decreasing those interest rates has different kinds of economic effects, depending on whether the president or the Federal Reserve Board or the economists of the country are more worried about inflation versus unemployment versus investment, all those things. Another thing they can do is called quantitative easing. And this is where the United States government buys up a bunch of, usually it's like government bonds that are held in private hands. But there can be other kind of financial assets that the Federal Reserve / the U.S. government can kind of purchase more of. And that, through various economic reasons, causes businesses and investors to invest more. And that is another tool they have to kind of influence the private economy by using only government money and government techniques, and not, violate the law. But everybody wants a good economy. Everybody wants people to be happy and healthy and make enough money to afford their house and their car and food and all those things. Now, we can affect lots of other policies using budgets and money. One of the things we can do if Congress really doesn't like some certain policy, there's some segment of Congress that says, well, that law passed over my strong objection, but I'm going to make sure it never has any real effect because I have extra amounts of power over the budgetary process. So yeah, you passed that policy, you created that agency, you created that program, but I'm going to make sure it gets either no budget at all or, a bare minimum budget so it can't actually do what it's attempting to do, right? Or I really like a certain policy or program, so they ask for a certain amount of money, I'm going to give them even more. I'm going to make sure they have more than enough money to really do their job and perform their, whatever that agency or policy or group is meant to do. So just because a policy is passed or created doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end of the fight to make sure that it's implemented well, right? Increases or decreases to their budget can have a huge impact on how effective that policy or agency or group can be. Something that Congress has been doing more and more and more over the past few decades is what's called prohibitory policy. And this is where Congress passes a budget or a law and says, hey, we're giving this amount of money to this agency, but none of this money can be used for this certain thing that we don't want to happen. So it's essentially giving that agency or group or program money, but with strings attached. You're not allowed to use any of this money on this certain act, right? The most famous example here is the Hyde Amendment, which has been included for many decades in the federal budget, that says that none of the money appropriated by Congress can be used to finance abortions. One of the methods of doing budgeting that is very common is called incremental budgeting, right? And this is where essentially every agency starts with the amount of money they got last year. If your agency got $100 billion last year, we're going to start with $100 billion this year. And then we're going to look at every agency and we're going to look at every organization, every group within the government. and we're just going to give you maybe a little bit more. Maybe you get 1% more, and this other agency gets 2 or 3% more. This agency is kind of out of favor with the current government, so we might give them a decrement, i.e., 1% less than they got last year. But essentially, we use every year's budget as the basis for this year's budget, and then just increase it or decrease it by usually very small amounts. And when you get more down into the specifics, they might say, okay, we're going to eliminate this program entirely from last year, but instead of using that money that you spent on that last year, we're going to give that over to this area of the same agency or same program. But with that kind of incremental budgeting, each year's budget stays roughly similar. And it just goes up or down a little bit year by year by year. More recently, however, they've switched over to what's called not necessarily an alternative to incremental budgeting. It's just kind of another way to look at it, which can be used alongside incremental budgeting. But it's what's called baseline budgeting. And with baseline budgeting, essentially you're predicting the future. Because most laws passed by Congress, most programs and policies that are implemented aren't one-year policies or one-year programs. These are things that are going to go on for 5 years or 10 years or theoretically into the infinite future. And thus, when we're doing our budget for this year, we want to plan for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, however many years down the line to know not only how much is this going to cost us this year, but how much is it going to cost us in the future, right? So we're going to kind of predict going out, say, 10 years, how much income are we going to get through taxation and all the other kind of funding streams for the U.S. government? And how much is this program going to cost? So if we're considering a new program for the Environmental Protection Agency, they might say, well, this year we want this amount of money. But we don't just want to know this year. We want to know if we implement this new program, how much is it going to cost next year and the year after and the year after. So we're going to predict our income, we're going to predict our expenses, and then we're going to be able to kind of see how much this is going to cost, not just this year or next year, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now. The problem is, this is kind of one of those, to borrow a phrase from computer science, it's a GIGO moment, or garbage in, garbage out. Because all of this prediction relies on a lot of assumptions. Is the economy going to get better or worse? Is tax revenue going to go up or down? Is the stock market going to go higher or lower? There's a ton of different assumptions that are made based on lots of different factors. And so Republicans might say, oh, this is going to cost us, our deficit based on this program, where it's going to increase the deficit by $50 billion over the next 10 years. But Democrats can say, oh, well, no, this policy is going to reduce our deficit by $50 billion over the next 10 years. And they're both just putting in their own assumptions about what's going to happen over the next 10 years. So they're both correct, but they've just plugged completely different assumptions and tax revenue ideas and costs that we really can't know that far out. I mean, we barely know that for this year what kind of tax money we're going to take in, what kind of money we're going to spend, how much certain things are going to cost. So if that's difficult to do for this year, doing it 5 or 10 years from now is essentially impossible. All right, we're going to take another break. We'll be back for another one.